Welcome everybody. My name's Duncan Edwards. I'm the Chief Executive of British American Business, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this British American Business roundtable discussion on preparedness for a return to travel, which must be the issue that people talk to me about more than any other at the moment. This is an issue, of course, that we've been working on at British American Business, frankly, since the start of the pandemic and the effective closure of international travel, both for leisure and for business. I guess we're talking to you now in the context of a report that will be due out in 10 days time from the—
I can't hear this.
From the global— You can't hear this? From the Global Travel Task Force. I hope everyone can hear me. I just heard someone—
I can hear you just fine.
Great, great, great. So we're going to have we've got a terrific panel lined up to talk about all the issues that employers need to think about as they prepare for their people to start traveling again. And to introduce that panel and to moderate today's discussion, I'm thrilled to welcome Sally Balcombe, who is I would say a travel expert with a long career in the travel industry, and is the CEO of Visit Britain. So Sally, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Well, Duncan, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. So let me take you through just a little bit of background, some house rules, and a breakdown of the programme. So we're going to have a discussion with our panel for about 40 minutes. And then the rest of the time will be dedicated to Q&A from all of you. So I hope you've got lots of questions, and we look forward to answering them. Please, will all attendees have their mics on mute so that we don't get lots of background noise. As I say, we really encourage you to send in questions, and we'll try to answer them. If you could submit those questions through the chat function, which is down at the bottom of your screen. You'll see this hot feature if you hover over it on the Zoom menu. And this session is also being recorded, so we can share it on request. So don't feel you've got to take notes. So I'm going to give you a little introduction on what we're going to cover today, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So as Duncan said, this is a very live issue on both sides of the Atlantic. And what we want to do is explore the issue of opening up travel from a number of different angles. Firstly, we're going to talk about the public health landscape, because all of this is in the context of that health landscape. And we want to think about it from both ends, from the UK and the US, and obviously how that landscape and how the health issues relate to travel and the opening up of travel. And then thinking about travel and safe travel, we want to explore demand. What's it looking like? How are airlines getting prepared for safe travel? And how will they open up? And then flipping to the other side, we think about travelers and we think about companies. And here we'd like to explore the duty of care. We'd like to explore issues around risk relating to travellers, and how we might best mitigate that risk. And finally, we want to talk about communications, travel policies, and the number of different messages coming out in this this area are huge numbers, and they're constantly changing. So how do you best communicate clearly and effectively in this space? So those are the areas that we're going to work our way through. And I'm delighted to be joined by a number of real experts. And I'm going to turn over and ask them to just briefly introduce themselves. And I'll start with Dr. Kevin Fleming. Kevin, over to you if you'll say a couple of words.
I'm Kevin Fleming, a physician and medical director at Mayo Clinic Healthcare in London. Excited to be here.
Great to have you. Thank you so much, Kevin. And then we're next joined by Hua Harvin, who is from Virgin. Hua, will you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Juha Järvinen. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Virgin Atlantic. Been in the company a bit over 2 years with responsibility for network planning, partnership, global sales, revenue management, governmental affairs, and holidays and cargo businesses. Very nice to be here.
Great to have you, Hua, and what a broad remit you have. Thirdly, we're joined by John Rose. John, will you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everyone. I'm the Chief Risk and Security Officer at Alltour, and my job's all external facing for clients. So a lot of people think of security officers as running the company security, but I do it advising our clients on mostly duty of care and travel risk management.
Thank you, John. And then finally, last but certainly in no way least, Jillian Edwards. So Jillian, will you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Jillian Edwards. I'm an associate partner at Samello, a communications consultancy based in London. We've been working with a number of clients, advising them throughout the pandemic, including International SOS, the medical and travel services company. And we've also been helping them launch one of the first digital health travel passports. And before Samello, I was head of media and PR at the Association of British Travel Agents.
Well, thank you all and welcome to you all. You obviously bring a huge amount of experience and insight, and we look forward to you all sharing that with us today. So let's start. Well, as you all know, it's been more than a year since the COVID-19 pandemic took hold. And whilst many countries are still in lockdown and are facing further waves, national vaccination programs, particularly in the US and the UK, are really starting to speed up and make a difference in terms of business leaders thinking about what's next on the horizon and the potential of some kind of normality and some possible potential return of business travel. But having said that, there's a huge amount of uncertainty out there. And what does safe travel look like? So I said we were going to start by thinking about the landscape we're all operating in, which is the landscape of health. So I'd like to start off by asking Kevin to give us an update on where the public health landscape currently stands, obviously, particularly referencing how it relates to international travel, whilst mitigating the health risk and really looking at it, as I say, from both ends of the route here, if you can. Kevin, really, could you give us your perspective? And if you could weave in what you think the current vaccination plans, how they will affect international travel would be great. And I think you've got some slides that you're going to share with us as well.
Yes, could you bring those up? So if you look at England and compare COVID to prior years, one can see how the deaths per 1,000 people are the same as in 2003 and far lower than the 1968 flu pandemic, about which people seem mostly unaware. Next slide. Vaccines against COVID take advantage of how the virus infects our cells. The spike protein is the orange triangle on the left, which gains entry to the cell through the ACE2 receptor below, which is that yellow triangle or yellow box, and then reproduces, causing symptoms and illness. Next slide. mRNA vaccines are like a few lines of code that make your cells create an antibody that blocks the virus from opening that lock. This type of vaccine is very new and different. It is not alive, it does not make copies of itself, it does not last for more than a few days, and then it disappears completely. Next slide. The COVID virus is very much like the flu virus and the common cold. Over time, it eventually mutates to escape our immunity. Mutations mostly occur at that S protein I discussed. The map here shows where various mutations have been found already. Like the 1918 Spanish flu is still here, and it's now called influenza A, COVID will stay around for decades. Therefore, zero COVID is simply not possible. Fortunately, most mutations are a single change to the S protein, so the vaccines can be expected to work against severe illness, even though there might be more mild disease spreading. This should be important for travel, as any of the vaccines should be sufficient for that purpose. Even better, the mRNA vaccines are able to be changed quite quickly by modifying the code where needed. This is already being done for the new mutations. Next slide. For air travel, the current science suggests that some measures just don't work, like temperature screens, which can be avoided, and spraying passengers with various things. Some things probably work, like vaccination, PCR testing, and the more rapid antigen testing, and increasing fresh air exchange, that is ventilation, in airports and airplanes, and passengers supplementing their own vitamin D. But uncertainty remains about the utility of masks, which only work with droplets and not aerosols, which is a mode of spread. Social distancing more than 3 feet, and quarantine, except in the few cases listed. Now, isolation, meaning not traveling, is mainly effective for protecting the frail elderly and the immunosuppressed. So that's the background at present, and really should inform how we proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So given all of that, what's your prediction? How do you think, I mean, both the US and the UK are doing well in terms of vaccinations, certainly relative to perhaps, in our case, mainland Europe. And given that on your list of things that will work, vaccinations is very clearly there. So what do you think, how do you think that will affect the vaccine, you know, the ability for air travel to open up, and specifically a US-UK corridor? I mean, this obviously is one of the busiest corridors in the world, and everybody on this call is particularly interested in that corridor. So do you think that vaccinations will be enough proof? Do you think it will affect the regulations? How do you see this playing out?
Well, I hope the science informs that, meaning that vaccines, and then if needed for further proof, PCR or antigen testing should be more than enough proof that someone is not infected. Beyond that are really political issues that have nothing to do with science. and unfortunately, that's where some of the argument is going to lie. Because realistically, this is like a very bad flu year, but it is nowhere near as bad as, say, Ebola or even the 1968 Hong Kong flu. And so our reaction to this is unprecedented.
Yes, I thought your first slide was very telling, because historically, I think our perception is that this would have been out on its own, and it clearly is not. So really, really interesting. So effectively, the groundwork is there. If we can get the vaccines done, and as you say, with some additional testing if required, the groundwork on the basis of science should be there for safe travel.
Yes, and it's important to recognize that the mutations are going to arise no matter what we do.
Yeah.
So calling something a UK mutation is really a misnomer, because it's arising in people in the US who have never traveled. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, we love the fact that we've named things like Kent mutations, and it never even started in Kent. So yes, there's a lot of false facts out there.
Right.
Okay, that's really interesting and a really good base for us to jump on to some of the other issues. So I'd like to turn the question now to how we can travel safely. So we've got the basis, we've got the science there. And obviously, I've referred to the fact that the US is pushing on very hard with vaccinations now. And I think, you've got President Biden's statement that the US will be independent of the virus by the 4th of July, which sounds very ambitious, but is very encouraging. And the US government's announcement that every adult, not everybody, every adult will have their first dose by the end of July. I'd like to now turn to Huaz and say, given all of that, given we've got the groundwork and the science and coming together and the vaccination, what are you hearing and seeing from Virgin's clients and customer base in terms of returning to travel? Is there a pent-up demand? And what are their concerns around air travel? And then if you could then go on and explain how you're addressing or responding to those concerns, that would be great.
Absolutely, thanks, Sally. I mean, first of all, it is, as we all know, it is unprecedented that the US-UK traffic has been basically on standstill for a year. And we currently, as an example of Virgin Atlantic, in normal times operate up to 6 to 7 daily flights between UK and New York. Currently, we're operating 1 daily flight. So that massive standstill in the world's biggest travel corridor is unprecedented. And not forgetting the price tag of that standstill. UK economy, it's costing us roughly £32 million per day that we don't have that UK-US traffic opened up. And as US is UK's second largest trading partner, so it's crucial both from a business and from a leisure perspective to get the borders open. Just give you a couple of numbers. Each year, roughly 4.5 million Americans visit UK, and almost the equivalent number, 4.8 million UK residents visit USA. So it's massive, massive numbers that we basically have been unable to travel, unable to trade, even though we can do a lot virtually, just like this meeting. It's never going to replace the face-to-face meetings that we also need in order to build businesses and develop the economies going forward. So there is a huge substantial pent-up demand for air travel, and we strongly believe that there is fundamentals, just like you just heard from Dr. Kevin as well, that there is a fundamentals to open up the borders in a safe manner so that we can go forward. Today, actually, it was an important research paper that came out from Oxera and Edge Health, which proved that single COVID-19 test, a rapid antigen test, is equivalent of a 10-day quarantine, home quarantine. So we have means to eliminate quarantine and utilizing testing to be equally safe and open these borders. So what we have done, of course, in the airline community overall is to make sure that we operate in a safe manner. And that is, of course, our number one priority. Whole airline industry is built around, first of all, security and safety. So what we've done at Virgin Atlantic and across all airlines, that ever since last year, we've been building procedures in-house to make sure that, first of all, our own crew is safe. So all our crew members are tested before departure to make sure that when they fly, they are tested negative. And now, as an example of Virgin Atlantic, all our passengers are requiring pre-departure testing to make sure that when we fly, we have negative tests. So that is a fundamental, which therefore gives us an opportunity to build that going forward. So what is crucial now that we, of course, move forward with these procedures. In-flight environment, we have already meticulous cleaning procedures on board. We are disinfecting the aircraft before each flight using hospital-graded registered disinfecting products. We have fogging, the electrostatic spraying of very high-grade disinfectant, which in all our cabins before each flight. So it's as clean as it can get in terms of the onboard experience. And of course, all the airports, everyone along the journey has geared up to the same standard to make sure that it is safe to travel. And what is, of course, crucial now that when we hopefully see US, UK being the first major market that we can start reopening with UK government now, hopefully in a few weeks' time on the 12th of April latest, reconfirming hopefully the 17th of May as the opening of traffic. We are ready as an industry to start serving customers, fly them again. and having either the pre-departure testing, arrival testing, or hopefully with no testing requirements for vaccinated passengers, we are ready to serve customers along the way. But we believe that governments have to come up with a tier-based, data-driven, fact-based model to assess the risks of various countries, the UK, US being the best example, where of course the vaccinations are already on a high level, and we believe that it's the right time now on the 17th of May in a safe manner, open the borders again.
Thanks, Hua. In fact, on the chat box, I see somebody, Duncan Edwards has basically said there's an interesting report published today which supports your position that you've just outlined, saying that testing on arrival is just as effective as a quarantine. And there's a link there for anybody who'd like to see it. And I'm sure that that will back up everything that Hua has been saying. Lots of things coming up in the chat that relate to what both Kevin and Hua have been talking about, and we will come back to some of those. I can tell you some of them there is not a clear answer for, and I don't know if this panel can give you a clear answer, but I understand why you're asking the questions. So Virgin is doing a huge amount, and we know that, and I think also Emma Sherborne has put in the chat box that you're part of the task force in the UK advising the government on that opening, and we certainly have that. And whilst I've got you, Hua, there is a question for you. With the airline industry laying off many employees, including flight deck, cabin crew, engineers, how long do you think it would take to get crews fit to fly again? Because of course they've been at home on furlough for a long time. Do they need to be retrained? There will be obviously limited, I mean, we're obviously very worried about pilots keeping up their flight capability. Will they be put on simulators? Is there going to be a limited availability of simulators? Can you just briefly comment on all of that?
That's right. It is 100% correct. It takes multiple months to make sure that we're back in the air, of course, safely. So many of our pilots have been on furlough for a year. So depending on aircraft type, they need to go through simulator training, and of course also test flights. So they will need to do a few flights before they can go into commercial operation and take lead. So in average, we would say 3 to 4 months we need as a lead time. So we are already now building towards the summer with the assumption that we can resume larger scale flying of June, July onwards. So we are already now ramping up towards that milestone with the desired position that we are able to restart. So that obviously drives cost for us, but that is the only way for us and for any airline to make sure that we're ready to serve when the borders are open. So it is a multi-month preparation. So it really depends on which aircraft types different pilots have flown, but it is crucial that we have everyone trained, everyone ready to fly again. But luckily we have obviously operated throughout the whole period, largely been flying cargo only flying. So many of our crew members have been working throughout the year, but there's a great number of pilots and cabin crew that have been on furlough for a year and require the required training. And that is what we are currently working on towards the summer build-up. So
it's a complete holistic approach for you.
That's right. And of course, some of these trainings are dependent on external service providers as well. So it is a holistic 360 plan, which we obviously are continuously revisiting and replanning as more and more information gets delivered.
That makes absolute sense. Thanks, Hua. So it's great to hear all the work that and investment that Virgin are putting in to ensure safe travels for passengers. But I'd like to sort of switch to the other side of the safe travel equation and really think about due diligence for the traveler and the companies when we're talking about business travel. So the companies the travelers may work for in terms of how you mitigate the risk whilst traveling. And I'd like to turn to John Rose now. And I'd like, John, if you would, to ask you to give your assessment of the risk when it comes to air travel and the factors that companies and travelers must think about to mitigate risk. And perhaps you'll give us your views on vaccine passports and insurance that are all coming into play in this space. So will you give us your perspective, please?
Sure, and thanks, Sally. From a risk perspective, the potential exposure while traveling is extraordinarily low. And I recommend this to all of our clients. Your chances of catching COVID on a flight are extremely low. So the fear of risk is going to be there. Everything's been beaten in our head over the last year, but like Dr. Fleming said, this isn't as bad as the 1968 flu, largely because of the way it was publicized. And yes, it's been horrific, a lot of loss of life. I'm not downplaying the disease, but the measures that have been taken are extraordinary. So the risk is not on the, from your door to your lodging, very, very low risk. And I recommend all our clients that guidance. The risk grows exponentially for the lodging facilities. And I encourage all of our clients to take a look at that, to revet all of their lodging. We've seen in the US market a tremendous demand for the Airbnb type of bookings, even on the business side, because consumers have a perception. I have no data points to support this. They have a perception an Airbnb is lower risk to them because someone will take care of their home differently than a hotel might, or you're not exposed to 500 other people in the hotel when you're in an Airbnb. So that's a consideration. But again, all of these risk levels are very low. In reality, I tell our travelers that they sometimes will come back and say, well, our business travelers aren't ready to travel again. Well, the numbers don't show that. I can give anecdotal evidence and data points. Anecdotal, I literally just got back from the airport. My oldest daughter was visiting for a week. She flew out this morning. She's on a 5-hour flight to DC. The flight is oversold, and there were 27 people on the upgrade list for first class. Now, those are business travelers who had their status grandfathered for another year that are flying for business. I mean, flying for leisure. Our leisure business in the US market is extraordinary right now. I believe the load factors are going to pass 70% this week. I know they were at 63% just a couple of weeks ago. People are traveling for leisure, and those are business travelers also traveling because they're already comfortable with the process. The reason leisure travel has responded so fast is the domestic US market is large, and international travel, the ones that are popular, don't have all the restrictions on them, because it really comes down to people don't want to deal with the testing, and they definitely don't want the threat of a 14-day quarantine in the country they go to. So that's really crushing the industry, and the politicians need to take a look at this on what is the real risk you're exposing here. It's extremely low. So why don't they loosen up certain corridors? Yes, there are countries that are out of control right now, and I understand lockdowns against places like Brazil that can't get this figured out. But when you look at what the UK is accomplishing and what the US is accomplishing, is extraordinary. You look at what China has accomplished. I believe the last numbers, they're at 94.2% of travel compared to 2019. They've recovered. They're done. They're back. One of the largest travel companies in the US, which predominantly specializes in leisure air, is back to 2019 levels. They can't keep up with demand because, again, the travel is responding. So what do we have to do to reopen these major corridors? And the biggest one, Sally, as you mentioned, goes into the vaccination passports. Now that's a quagmire right now. There are 12 apps and tracking on who's ready to do this, who's going to be able to get the data, what's going to be able to be entered into your information, who's going to accept it. But I also caution this, there's a huge financial reason to get this working for the government level. The governments need this. You know, we're losing billions of dollars because these corridors aren't open. We can solve this quickly, because think about it like whether it's in the US, the global entry pre-check program, sure, that was a mess at the beginning, just like anything, but those weren't driven by need. Those were driven by kind of, this would be nice to have, and then it made the experience exponentially better. And same thing in the UK with the registered traveler program. There's no reason we can't get the vaccination proof into this. Also, I'm advising our clients, the reality is vaccination proof is going to be here to stay for a long time. There are already countries implementing it. On the leisure side, we're seeing tour operators and cruise lines mandated after a date. You're going to have some sort of vaccination proof, or you'll have to go through, I believe the EU laid out, you have to have proof of a test, or you have to have proof that you had COVID. Now, Dr. Fleming may be able to answer how long that window will be, because it's not going to be for years. I believe 6 months is something that I've heard, but it's the reality. We have to open up the corridors when they're open for safe travel. And again, the US domestic market and the Chinese domestic market are proof. There's no quarantines, because the quarantines that we had in the US largely weren't enforced. If anyone ever experienced that, they were just nice things. Oh, I'll quarantine for 2 weeks in New York. Nobody enforced it. It was a joke. The same ones we had out here in California, the quarantines, nobody enforced them. So it was just more of a guideline. It was trying to tell people, be responsible and keep this spread down, which I do support that completely. But we've got to figure out if the US market, which is massive domestically, I mean, we've got 5.5-hour flights. These aren't short haul flights. Same thing within China, they're long flights. If this isn't spreading the disease and showing any types of spikes, why can't we open up the corridors, especially the United Kingdom, because that is the most important business travel route in the world, New York, London, and that opens up so much commerce, but it also opens up that leisure travel. Let's not ignore the fact that we all need travel, period. And when people start flying even for leisure to London, that will drive the recovery of the business travel, because the companies are a little bit afraid right now to push it forward. But the other, 800-pound gorilla in a proverbial sense is, wow, the CFOs are like, we just cut our travel budget to 10% last year. This is an awesome savings. Can't you guys just Zoom for the rest? Your efficiency was pretty good. Now, there's obviously business reasons to do that, but I've heard financial officers say this. But when the business travelers are back traveling leisure, they'll be ready to travel for business, and there won't be that fear factor. And of course, another big one, because I ask a lot of clients, I get on with anywhere from 10 to 12 companies a day. The mask is a huge issue on long haul flights. I'm not going to lie. I talked to one the other day. She went to Dubai on leisure. She had a great trip. She said it was a nightmare. She had to cover her head up to take her mask off to sleep. I go, oh, what about flying that for business? She goes, no way. I'm not going to let an employer tell me to do that and wear a mask for 14 hours on a flight. Now, that's anecdotal information. There's no data points I have on that, but that's a realistic scenario. Once they're able to say, if Emirates comes out and says everyone on board has to be vaccinated and you don't have to wear a mask, that could be a game changer in this aspect. And I've heard those things. I've heard even big restaurants talking about sections. If you could prove your vaccination, they're considering then they can go back to normal distancing where they can get back to full capacity. Of course, we have some large US states at full capacity now, such as Texas, which is millions and millions of people live there, in our second largest state. So those are important directives. And of course, our task force, which I sit on one of the national task force also, which now we change the names, to push the politicians. Let's look at this. Let's let the doctors who are pushing the real data points. And of course, what they want is those first inklings of herd immunity, but we've got to have the vaccination passports to tie that in to the movement of people once they say you've got herd immunity, because we can't have spikes coming back, because everyone will completely overreact to a spike.
Thanks, John. Lots and lots of stuff in there, but the one bit you didn't cover, which is a big issue here in the UK, and I'd just like to get your view on, is insurance.
Yes.
So, for example, I am hearing from the business events sector that they're having to pull or cancel quite a lot of planned events because they can't get insurance. They're ready to go, they've got all the protocols in place, but the insurance companies aren't playing, and so the events are getting cancelled. Talk to me about insurance, or talk to the group about insurance, and if you could keep it relatively short, that would be great.
Yeah, because I'm long-winded, I'm passionate about this. So the 2 points you brought up is, one is the underwriting risk for concentration. They don't want the concentrated risk for the event. So that's just the reality of the underwriters. And I was an executive at AIG for 14 years, so I've got a lot of background in that. It's concentrated risk they won't take. So until they feel there's enough vaccinations in place to have herd immunity, they're not going to touch it. Once that happens, maybe July 4th in the US, as we've mentioned, the underwriters will start, because as soon as they think they can write it profitably, they will open that up. The second piece is, though, for the individual travelers, a number of countries have already implemented mandatory proof of insurance, and they're designating who they accept. And I heard one insurance executive offline told me he believes it'll be more than 100 countries by the end of the year will have implemented this type of proof. And you have to show it when you enter with your passport. And it may be one of the country's insurance companies. Some of the big ones like AIG and Chubb are rapidly getting approved by these countries, but people have to be wary of the business traveler. And just because they have a health plan in the US, or just because you have a BTA policy at your company, doesn't mean that's going to work for them in that country. So it's one more layer the travel departments have to sort through. But Sally, insurance is going to be a big play. And the reality is most countries were really crushed by COVID. They can't afford the risk of you getting into their country and becoming hospitalized without them knowing they have a guarantee of payment. And companies like International SOS are wonderful at making sure you've got guarantee of payment to enter the country. But that's going to be a big factor. And I don't know about the US-UK market, which we're specifically talking about today. I don't see the UK putting an insurance proof on US citizens, but other countries that they may pass on to absolutely are going to do that. So it's going to be another box that the travel departments have to work on a lot harder than they did historically. Old people like me remember when Eastern Europe used to require that. So yes, it was not that hard to have the proof of insurance to go to Eastern Europe. It's just another piece to the puzzle.
Great, thank you so much, John. Just before I move on to my questions for Jillian, can I just encourage you all, there's been some good questions coming in on the chat box, but I am going to open it up much more widely when we've heard from Jillian. So I'm encouraging you to get as many questions up there as possible that you'd like to ask, because I will try and weave them in, I will try and answer them and get our group of experts to answer them. So moving on, Jillian, so we are talking about a lot of uncertainty, and certainly here in the UK, the comms around this has been a challenge. I know my own team have led on a lot of comms, and it's been constantly changing. How would you advise business leaders, and many of those on the call, to handle this? How do you best communicate the changes, particularly to employees who are thinking about business travel or companies who are thinking about it? How do we get clarity of communication? What's your advice about communication in this very, very muddled world?
Well, as you say, Sally, it's going to be absolutely critical to have really clear communication as soon as people are able to go back to travel. I think one of the first things that companies can do is to have the basic housekeeping. So update the travel policies, make sure that those are clearly communicated to people who might be traveling or who are going to be booking travel. We know, for example, the fines that have been introduced in the UK require travel for essential purposes only at the moment. We don't know how long that's going to be in place. So it's really important that people know how they should be booking, when they are permitted to travel so that they don't get their company into unwarranted fines, and what the processes are for that. And then I think a really important part is going to be having very clear communications to the people who are actually traveling. A lot of people have been stuck in their houses for the last 12 months. So even if they were sort of regular seasoned travelers before, they may not have traveled for 12 months. And travel's going to be very different when people can go back. We've talked about masks on long haul flights. The pre-departure experience is going to be different. There's different tests that you might be required to do, possibly proof of vaccination for certain destinations. The actual travel experience is going to be very different through the airports, on the plane, and then the arrival experience is going to be different. And it's also going to be different in the destination that you're traveling to. And we know from COVID that every country has its own system for managing the pandemic. And even within the United States, there are very, very different rules and regulations that are being applied state by state. Some states like Florida are very open, others have more rules and regulations in place. And in the UK, if a US traveller is coming to the UK, do they know about things like the rule of six? So really, really important to make sure that you're giving your travelling employees clear expectations, clear guidelines, possibly training even if they're going to be traveling regularly, on where they can go to get the information that they need about the destination they're going to. The other aspect for employees that's going to be important is letting them know where they can go to get support. Now, we know from our work with International SOS, they have been assisting people who have been traveling throughout the pandemic. And the number of calls for assistance that they've received from the people that are traveling has skyrocketed, because people have got more concerns. They want to know about requirements for entry. They want support. They might have got ill whilst they're traveling, and they need to know where they can go for assistance. So that's going to be really important. And I think also making sure that people feel comfortable and secure in traveling. There may be employees who are being asked to travel who still have concerns. Perhaps they haven't had the vaccination. They might be concerned from a health point of view about COVID. So it's really important that there is an open dialogue with people who are traveling, for them to be able to express any concerns that they've got. And they're not being forced into traveling, because I think that could throw up some issues as well. And the final thing I think that companies need to really think about is their crisis plans for the resumption of travel. Now, I think we've pretty much all been in crisis mode the last 12 months, and hopefully most companies will have a pretty well-oiled machine by now. But the crisis, although we've gone through the sort of initial stages, we are still in an evolving crisis. There are still things out there that we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen with variants. We don't know how long immunity is going to last from the vaccination. We don't know if it can still be transmitted. And we're also seeing situations change very rapidly. Just in the last week, we've seen Europe go into much more harder lockdowns. So things we know in this pandemic can change really rapidly, and organizations need to be prepared for that. I think it's a good time to do scenario planning, to think about the new threats that are out there, but also think back about some of the issues that perhaps have gone under the radar over the last 12 months, social unrest, terrorism, natural disasters, the sort of things that we were well prepared for before, but perhaps might not have experienced as much over the last 12 months. So it's important to really refresh all the crisis plans and make sure that we're fully prepared.
Jillian, that's great, really clear stuff, so really useful. I think there's a great question in the chat box, which I was just going to go to, because it plays to your point about where do you go for information, where do you get to the support? And it's from Ron Bornstein, who says, how can one find out if one has a good reason to travel outside the UK under the current rules, other than the examples given by the government? Would they be more loosely interpreted in the case of an American citizen in the UK resident traveling to the US? So I'm not sure what the answer is, but do you have any advice as to where you would go to get that information?
I mean, it's a very good question. We've been given very broad advice from the government as to what counts as essential. So I think going to your company to ask them to clarify is a first step. But yeah, it is blurry and it is unclear. So those are the sort of things that need to be clarified, and there will be specific cases that perhaps don't fall into those categories that the government has spelt out.
Great, thank you. Well, I am now going to open up more broadly to the questions. So as I say, just a reminder, keep them coming in. There's a really good one here for you, Juha, which is really about the connectivity or the relationships between airlines. So if I could, it's from Joe Harvey. Given airlines operate nowadays within complex partnerships with other airlines, how do you ensure that all your previous partners follow the same protocols that you're putting in place? And as customers need to consider the sort of end-to-end, how do you work that across? I'm sort of summarizing, so that you can actually go ahead and make bookings on things like code shares, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk a bit about that, Juha?
Yeah, sure. So one, when it comes to the US, if we start with that US traffic that we share in a joint venture together with Delta and Air France-KLM. So we have a continuous exchange of best practice, and also we're actually testing various health pass IT providers as well across the JV joint venture, to make sure that we are, first of all, capable of exchanging data. That's one thing, but also making sure that we have the information to share to one another. What are the procedures on board? at the airports. And of course, increasingly, airlines are all going in the same direction. So in that sense, I would say in the big scheme of things, almost all airlines follow very similar procedures. So in what it comes to the in-flight and airport processes, they are very, very alike. When it comes to the health pass, digital health passes, which has been a lot of questions about it here as well, it is crucial that we test various technologies now to make sure that when the volumes come back and great number of people are traveling, we do need to automate and standardize the way that we track, being it the certificates for either a PCR or antigen test or vaccination. They need to be standardized because just as an example, the airport process times can be up to 15 minutes to check these various documents. You can imagine it's doable now when you have 20%, 30%, 40% load factors on board, but when we then will be returning to a more normality to 70, 80% load factors on all flights, the process times at airports will be substantially longer. So we do need to find a way to standardize them. And we have encouraged the UK government, who's leading the G7 summit now in June in Cornwall. So we have been trying to get UK government to take the lead and hopefully together with US government to actually try to come up with a standardized approach in June to have a global standard, because we do need to standardize it and it will last. We will not be out of COVID by 2021. We do need to find a way to live with this situation for potentially a number of years before we globally are in a situation where we don't have to track this anymore. So we do need to standardize it so that it's quick for the airlines, for the service providers that we use at the airport in a reliable manner to check the documents that are needed. And hopefully, step by step, we move to a tier system where hopefully UK and US could lead the way already now in May by classifying countries and making sure that we can exempt vaccinated passengers some of these procedures. But we need to have a way to check that the documentation is correct, and therefore digital solutions are crucial. And we work with across the airlines to make sure that we standardize. We all have the same need. So regardless if we're competitors or not, this specific question, we all 100% aligned.
So this issue of standardization is going to be a really, really important one in terms of documentation, approach, vaccination, passports, etc., etc. Kevin, if I could come to you more for a view, because I understand that this is getting into a slightly political space, but if vaccines are accepted for travel, then surely quarantine restrictions must be lifted to get travel moving again. Would that be your read of how it's going to play out?
It should do, but the problem is, as has occurred over the past year and a half, that some of these decisions aren't based on any science, but the concern that something might not work, and so they don't want to be blamed. Really, you can't get rid of this virus. It's going to be around, and we have to learn to live with it. And the best that we can do is say, there's vaccines, they work pretty well, and that should be sufficient for people to be able to move about freely. There is no way of completely eradicating this or completely eradicating transmission. You can limit the damage, and that's the best you can ever do. And so we really need to get people back into normal lives or near normal lives compared to what we've been doing.
Thanks. There's an interesting question here from a hotel supplier, because we focus very much on airlines, but I think as John talked about, actually, when people travel, they're obviously spending actually more time in accommodation usually. And the question was, from a hotel supplier perspective, in addition to the brand's website, are travel advisors still using the GDS, such as the HOD, as a resource of duty of care details? With rapid changes, hotels can update GDS information more quickly than a brand website. What do you think people are using, John, in your experience, to keep the information up to date, and what are people using to find out what's going on in the hotel space?
Well, there's really two sides to that. One is the travel booking process will rarely ever look at anything for duty of care, because that sits on the organization, not the travel booking. The organization says, we have a preferred agreement with this particular hotel chain, that's who you're going to book. So unless asked, the travel advisor is not going to dig into that. On the leisure side, they will. And what they largely do is they will use some of it from the GDS, but in reality, they don't trust that information because we don't know what that actual hotel is doing unless we know that hotel. So the counselors will sell the properties that they know, that they have interaction with, that they may have called and said, can you send us your current protocols on what you're doing so I can tell my travelers, this is the leisure side, what ones I recommend. On the corporate side, as I mentioned earlier, we're recommending to go back to all of your preferred lodging and ask them for specific information. And if they refuse, ask a third party to do what's called a hotel assessment. It's not expensive. It's something easily can be done to say, do you really meet the standards that we're requiring? Because companies, and rightfully so, are very paranoid about the liability they may face. If they put a business traveler in a property and they contract COVID, there's a lot of liability there. And if they said, hey, we took the proper duty of care steps, and just asking a hotel for a piece of paper isn't usually enough, or definitely not something that's on a website. Now, a major chain that has some sort of certification, I've seen some certifications for health, and maybe Dr. Fleming has some opinions on those different certifications, if they're actually good or if they're just pay to play type of options. But that is something that we're seeing on national TV commercials in the US market now. There's a healthy business certification, and I really don't know the credibility behind that yet because it's so new.
Well, I'm just going to put a chip in. I'm only supposed to be asking questions, but I'll put a chip in because there's something going on in the UK that probably does speak to this. So we have put in place a protocol called We're Good to Go. We've now got about 50,000 businesses signed up here in the UK. It's now being accredited by WTCC, and my organization is checking that. And that is an assurance to people when they travel that all of the COVID protocols are undertaken, it is being checked, all the health, hygiene, social distancing requirements are being met. So certainly something like that is in place in the UK. Jillian, some interesting questions on comms here, on a couple of points. It says here, then there also needs to be clear comms to those who are receiving these international business travelers for their meetings. So it's not just about the traveler. And that those people are receiving clear sort of client protocols. Is there anything you would say about the receiving end, not just the traveler traveling? And there's a supplementary quick question about international SOS, you having said that you have a background of supporting them. Did they move to a subscription model? I was using heavily at the beginning of the pandemic and found it a go-to source, but then at some point couldn't get access to information. Any comment on those two questions or parts of questions?
So just on that last point first, I'm not sure which bit of information you're referring to, but they do have a very good map of COVID restrictions globally. So it could be that that's being referred to. And that is, I think they may have had it public at the start, but now it's available for clients. And then on the second point about destinations, I think that is a really valid point, because as we all know, this is a global pandemic, and by its nature, we're only going to fix the pandemic globally. So it's no good people being able to travel and then not being aware of what to do in countries. So definitely, I think there's a lot of work to be done there to make sure that travelers know what to do on arrival. And I think that's split, that I think there's responsibility there for the traveler and for the company that is sending the traveler abroad to make sure that they're aware of local rules and regulations, but also for the destination. So when people arrive in country, that they know what to do. If there's a quarantine in place, for example, where do they go? And I think that's an area where there's room for improvement, it's probably fair to say. We saw from the UK's own experience of that last summer that people could just arrive and didn't really get a lot of information when they arrived in the UK as to what they were meant to be doing if they were meant to go into quarantine. So I definitely think that's an area that airports and destination tourist boards can look at.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to have to wrap this up a bit. We've got some questions we haven't got to. I'm really sorry about that. I mean, obviously there's the one question that everybody everybody asks on all of these calls, well, with the prevalence of Zoom and other video services, are we going to permanently travel less? I think John's already offered an opinion on that, but that one always comes round. So I'm just going to ask all of our panelists to say a few final words of how they would sum up the issues and the takeaways that they would like to leave you with. So if I can start right at the start again with Kevin, please.
I would just reiterate that traveling appears to be safe, that like with prior pandemics, people need to be able to self-select and say, I'm personally at risk, whereas the vast majority of the population is really at risk only for very mild disease. And therefore, the vaccine by itself should be able to expand travel and allow people to drop certain measures like even masks, but certainly quarantine, because that is the best that we can do, and therefore should progress from there.
Thank you. Hua.
Yes, travel and tourism industry, we stand for 10% of global GDP. It is so important that we now work with the roadmap to get out of the pandemic and also restart global travel. We can't lose another summer season. So I'm really pleading all the businesses and associations on this call as well. You are extremely influential. Now is the crucial day, both in the UK and US side, to try to influence both governments to make sure that UK, US could be the first major market to reopen in a safe manner. And as you see, I'm sitting here all by myself in upper class. We're feeling very lonely. So very keen to have you on board Virgin Atlantic very soon.
Yeah, we love your seat, Hua. John, final thoughts from you.
Sure. I've been referred to as the optimistic risk guy, which is kind of an oxymoron in that aspect, but I am very optimistic on the recovery. And one of the biggest things I'm advising our clients on is, as they put everything together for recovery, everything moves faster and grander because of the way the world works today. So you had better be prepared for this to rebound faster than you're anticipating. We're seeing that already happen in the leisure business. Be prepared, because you're going to get caught behind, and you could get caught behind your competitors. So be ready for herd immunity to be announced and everybody starts traveling again. Just be prepared, because otherwise it could take you a long time. And of course, keep pushing for vaccination standardization, because I can't reiterate how important that's going to be. I know if you're through the comments, because if it gets bogged down and takes years to fix, that's not going to help any of us open up these routes.
Absolutely. And Jillian, some thoughts and takeaways from you.
Yeah, well, I would definitely echo John's comments that there's a huge pent-up demand and things could get back very quickly. I think in the immediate short term, when travel does reopen, we have to remember that there are going to be no seasoned travellers. So it's going to be really important, in order to build back confidence, to have very clear, very empathetic communications with those that are travelling.
Thank you. And if I can just say a final word before I turn back to Duncan, it's been a pleasure to talk to you all today. We've heard a lot of really interesting insights, but I think everybody on this call would welcome the opening up of travel, myself included, and we cannot wait to get Americans flying back to the UK. So please come, and please come soon. Duncan, some final words from you.
Well, thank you, Sally. And I knew this would be a superb session today, and of course it lived up to that. And we could clearly have taken, twice the amount of time to cover all the points. And just thanks to all the panelists, but Sally in particular, thank you for brilliantly moderating the session. You were superb. I just want to echo the point that Juha made. It is very important that businesses not connected with the travel and hospitality industry make the point to their governments that travel is important to them. And if you would like, please talk to us. We're putting together a statement that will be issued next week in anticipation of the Global Travel Task Force review. And we really need companies not connected with travel and tourism to make the point that travel is important to their well-being and their business. So if you'd like to go on the record and make a statement, please get in touch. And in the meantime, thank you all very much for joining today. It's been a very strong turnout, as we knew it would be. So thank you all and see you all soon.